what is your personal opinion on Abraham's existence? Do you think he's probably a fictional, mythological origin character in a way? I mean,
yes, I would agree with that. He is an important figure in theology, but he is at a time in history that I think the biblical writers knew very little about. It's the language of Genesis is what is referred to as standard biblical Hebrew. That is, it was the language of about the 8th century. It doesn't reflect the Hebrew that would have been around in the time of probably of David, certainly not in the time of Abraham. It wouldn't have been understood. The archaeology of those sites doesn't match in existence at that time.
we are MythVision. Welcome back to MythVision Podcast. I'm your host, Derek Lambert. Today, I have a special guest. Actually, I don't know if any of you know who the gentleman is, but I'm going to introduce him here. And it is Dr. Lester L. Grabbe, and that is probably the anglicized version of the name from German. But Dr. Grabbe is a retired American scholar and emeritus professor of Hebrew Bible and early Judaism at the University of Hull, England. I'd like to show you some of the publications he has so you can go get you a copy, because I'm certain that some of these will pique your interest as they did me. An introduction to Second Temple Judaism, history and religion of the Jews in the time of Nehemiah, the Maccabees, Hillel, and Jesus. That covered a pretty vast amount of time period, actually. It piques my interest to really want to dig and see what he says, and I'd love to do more episodes where we cover some of this content for you, the audience, to learn, because this is where the meat is. You really want to get Judaism, you need to know Second Temple Judaism for sure. The other stuff's fun. First Temple Judaism is exciting, all of that, and even First Temple. We talking Canaanite. We might even get into some of this stuff today. But A History of the Jews and Judaism in the Second Temple Period, Volume 2, The Coming of the Greeks, the Early Hellenistic Period. Also, Genesis, Procreation and the Politics of Identity, Old Testament readings. Ezra, Nehemiah readings, Old Testament readings. Judaic religion and Second Temple Period, belief and practice from the exile to Yavne. Ancient Israel, what do we know and how do we know it? Revised edition. A History of the Jews and Judaism in Second Temple Period, Volume 3, the Maccabean Revolt, Hasmonean Rule, and Herod the Great. That's got my interest, of course, too, because we get into the New Testament stuff as well. Priests, prophets, diviners, sages, a social historical study of religious specialists in ancient Israel. A History of Jews and Judaism, Second Temple Period, Volume 4, the Jews under the Roman shadow. Good Kings and Bad Kings, the Kingdom of Judah in the 7th century BC. A History of Jews and Judaism, the Second Temple Period. And this is the Persian period. You definitely want to get a hold of all of this here. Inquire of the Former Age, Ancient Historiography, and Writing the History of Israel, the Library of the Hebrew Bible, Old Testament Studies. Judaism from Cyrus to Hadrian, the Roman period. Israel in Transition 2, from Late Bronze 2 to Iron 2A. The text, the Library of the Hebrew Bible, Old Testament. I mean, look at how much he has written. I can't. So look, we'll stop here because honestly, I think the whole show might consist of me listing off the amount of works that Dr. Grabbe has done. So I really wanted to flex on you for this first episode to understand the caliber of scholarship that we're discussing today, the gentleman that's bringing the insights. So finally, welcome to MythVision.
Thank you. I have to confess, though, that not all of those that you listed are works that I've personally written. Mm-hmm. Several of them you mentioned, I was the editor or co-editor, which means that I wrote an article or an introduction, and in some cases wrote actually quite a bit that's in there, but it's most of it is contributions, more than half is from other people. So several of those are works that I edited rather than authored, to use that term. But I have written about 20 books that I've authored, and I've I've edited about another 20. So one of the things when I review books that I complain about is editors who simply collect essays and put them between two covers and send them off to the publisher, because I think the editor has a lot of work that should be done, which includes reading the material, summarizing it for the reader, and giving an introduction of some sort to it. So I've done that with all the books that I've edited. I've actually written at least an introduction to it, and usually I've contributed an essay or maybe more than one essay in the volume itself. But I can't claim quite all of those that you listed as authored. So.
Well, you're aware of the material, obviously. You go very deep into this material. I saw an interview with you on Closer to Truth, and I said, wow, I really should talk to this gentleman. You were getting into Genesis, talking about some of the material there, and I was thinking origins of Israel maybe might be an interesting discussion as well. We could start as far back as we can and then work our way closer towards Jesus, if that makes sense, if that's something you're interested in doing. So simply put, maybe we talk about the origins of Israel. And could you tell us the development and the angle you might take? I mention this because I asked archaeologist Ehrman, for example, like, how do you think the origin of Israel took place? And he thinks it's centuries of narrative and oral tradition that's probably compiled together that is trying to create, whereas, like, someone who's evangelical, like I once was, might say, well, duh, don't you read the Bible? The Exodus is the development and how its origins happen. And it's like, hold on, what about the Philistine? Like, these people, they played a significant role in the development of Israel itself, according to Ehrman. Of course, Genesis mentions them before they actually exist, so it seems anachronistic, right? So there's like, what's going on here? There's a lot of fun stuff like that, and I know that you will be able to catch those things and be able to bring them out to us. So how would you like to start?
Well, starting with the origins of Israel actually is my latest book, which is still in the press. It hasn't actually appeared. It's called The Dawn of Israel. Though the subtitle is the history of Canaan in the second millennium BCE, because what I do is I try to survey that area, the area of Canaan, Palestine, and ask, where did Israel originate? What information do we have? Can we find evidence for its origins? And basically, it's going over material. A lot of it is material that specialists will be aware of, so it's not that new in that sense, but it was trying to ask, have we overlooked anything? It's interesting you mentioned Ehrman. He's an archaeologist, and I know him and respect his work, and I think he and I would agree on a lot of things. And of course, his specialty is the Philistines. He's been excavating a site in Israel for the last, 15 years, which is quite an important one. But I would agree that there is a long history. And what we find is in the second millennium, that is from about 2000 to 1000 before the Common Era, we find various groups of people in, all over the ancient Near East. We have the Assyrians, the Babylonians, which everyone has heard of. We have a group called the Arameans. They come along later, closer to 1000. But they are perhaps more closely related to Israel. They spoke a language, Aramaic, which eventually many Jews spoke, and actually became language that was spoken widely in the Babylonian area. They, of course, originally spoke Babylonian and continued to use the Babylonian language, which was written in cuneiform script. But when we start looking for Israel, I was wondering, do we see anything relating to Israel elsewhere in the ancient Near East? And I really couldn't find a lot. But in the biblical text, of course, you have the idea that Abraham came from Ur of the Chaldees. Chaldee is another term relating to Mesopotamia. but actually Chaldean doesn't. The Chaldeans don't come along until later, about 1,000 years after Abraham is alleged to have existed.
Mhm.
So that is an anachronistic term. But it does, the biblical text does associate him with Mesopotamia and says that he migrated to then Canaan, what was then Canaan.
Dr. Grabbe, if you don't mind, I might interject just to get like questions or while we go along with this thinking.
Yes.
Just to clarify, what is your personal opinion on Abraham's existence? Do you think he's probably a fictional, mythological origin character in a way? I mean, it doesn't take away the value of, like, how do I put this? There are foundation myths, and I wonder if there's
Right.
foundation characters, if that makes sense. And he seems like one to me. What are your thoughts?
Yes, I would agree with that. He is an important figure in theology, in Jewish theology. And of course later in Christian theology as well. He's an example. He's someone to look up to in his actions and so on, his being faithful to God and all of this. But he is at a time in history that I think the biblical writers knew very little about, because I don't think the biblical text was written down until probably 7th, 8th centuries. They started writing some parts of it and so on, and they were passing down oral stories and so on. But so he's 1,000, 1,500 years before that.
Right.
And they remember, or they envisage a character who did certain things and so on. But when we start asking, did he actually exist? It's very difficult to know. We simply don't have any direct information. And when we look at the tradition about Abraham, we find anachronisms in it that suggest that at least parts of it were written down or were learned or were developed later on and reflect a different background from the one that would have been there around 2000 before the Common Era.
Do you happen to have a date you would put on when you think this, if I could use the word narrative, because whether there was a guy or not, what we have is a story. Do you happen to put a date potentially of, we know Assyria and Babylon are playing a role in the 8th century, 7th century BC, especially
Right.
Assyria, they were the major players. But when do you think Abraham's story developed in Israel?
I think the story as we have it probably came along about that time. Now, how much earlier material they had, I don't know. But as it was passed down, it was shaped and developed. And the language it's in, for instance, the language of Genesis is what is referred to as Standard Biblical Hebrew. That is, it was the language of about the 8th century. And it doesn't reflect a Hebrew that would have been around even in the time of probably of David. Certainly not in the time of Abraham. It wouldn't have been understood. So while we don't have any examples of that language, we do have comparative language like Ugaritic and so on, which is related, and it's a different language from that's found in Genesis and the rest of the Pentateuch, Exodus, and so on. They're all in a fairly standard Hebrew of the time of about the 8th, 7th centuries before the Common Era.
Thank you. Sorry I interrupted.
No, that's fine. Please do.
Yeah. So, okay, we're tracing back. We're in this Canaanite time, it seems.
Yes.
And we're trying to get from Canaanites to Israelites. And
yeah. Well, there we have to go to Egypt, and Egypt is very much important. It's obviously important in the biblical tradition, Exodus and so on. But we find in the Egyptian records, which it's mainly in the Egyptian records that we know about Canaan of this time, because in Mesopotamia, while we know something about the history of Mesopotamia, they don't really talk about Canaan because it was outside the sphere of influence of most of their kings and writers and so on. We do occasionally hear about one or two cities that in the very far north of of Canaan. But anyway, in the Egyptian records, we know about groups of people, and they're given names that we're to some extent guessing what they are, but there's fairly general consensus among Egyptologists of people who came into Canaan from, or Canaanites who went into Egypt or were in contact with Egyptians. And then Egypt, starting from about 1800, before the Common Era, they actually take over Canaan. So they, or at least they have incursions into there to steal steal riches and make slaves. And in some cases, they fight against the Canaanites, and others they have the overwhelming force. But from these, we know about Egyptian contact with the Canaanites and with Canaan, and they name cities. Sometimes they're names that we don't find, in the biblical text. In other cases, their names are close enough that we can say, oh, well, this is probably such and such a place. For instance, the city of Megiddo in northern Canaan, south of the Sea of Galilee, is quite an important name that comes up in a lot in the Egyptian records, because the Egyptians besieged it several times. They took it, and there were fights around there and so on. But what we find is that there were apparently people brought in from Canaan who seem to have been, in some cases, they were slaves and so on. And then there were others who seemed to be migratory groups that would come to Canaan, bring their livestock, especially in times of drought. They were coming looking for food, for water. And so we know something about them, and they seem to be Semitic speaking peoples. The Egyptians were not Semitic. They were another group and spoke another language. They spoke Egyptian is not Semitic. It's maybe very distantly related. Some classify it as Hemito-Semitic. But anyway, there are Semites that the Egyptians come into contact with, and these may have been some of the ancestors of Israel. It's been speculated that they were, and there are reasons for thinking that, but we don't know a lot about them. There were groups that were around the sea, the Dead Sea, that the Egyptians refer to, in some cases fought against. They may have something to do with ancient Israel, but we're not absolutely sure. And we finally get the name Israel first mentioned around 1200 before the Common Era in an inscription by a pharaoh named Merneptah. And he says that he destroyed Israel, along with, he mentions a couple of places in Canaan. And it looks like he may be referring to Israel as a people rather than as a place. Now, this has to do with the Egyptian way of writing these things. They would put what is called a determinative that would indicate if it's a city, they would put a determinative for city. If it's a people, they have a little different determinative, and it looks like it refers to Israel as a people. And it's generally agreed this is how it's written. Of course, in Egyptian, Israel is written not straightforwardly as Israel, but it's close enough that generally people identify it as Israel. A few want to say it's something else, but most say it's Israel. So we first have reference to Israel, but some have said, this is about the time of the Exodus, and therefore this may have something to do with it. But Merneptah says he defeated them. In fact, he says he destroyed them. So how does this have anything to do with an Exodus from Egypt? When we look at Egyptian history, we don't find any time when some group devastated by plagues and various things Egypt, and then left with a high hand, taking several million people and cattle and so on. If we want to argue for an Exodus, we can't find anything like an Exodus in the Bible. Some have said, well, it's maybe a small group left, escaped slaves who were Maybe it was a regiment or something of the army was sent after them and got overwhelmed by a storm or something like that. And this is possible that that's where it could be, but there was nothing like what we find in the book of Exodus in Egyptian history. And that whole period, we know a great deal about it. It was the 18th dynasty of ancient Egypt. Merneptah was the 19th, so it had just finished, and he was in a slightly different dynasty. But people like Ramses II, some said, well, he is the pharaoh of the Exodus. And he seems to be that way in Cecil B. DeMille's version of the Exodus with Charlton Heston and so on.
I love that movie.
But Yul Brynner might make a good Ramses II. But Ramses II was a king who ruled for 66, I think something like 66 years. And he was an important pharaoh, and he conquered, he had excursions into Canaan and did a lot of fighting and so on. And he also fought even went further north and fought against the Hittites. But he was a mighty pharaoh. There was no exodus, people leaving a devastated Egypt under him. So when we look at history and look at the history that we have, obviously we don't have everything that happened. This is the nature of ancient history. We have only bits and pieces, but we have enough to say there's no place for an exodus, at least as described in the Bible. And yet we do know that there was some group, some entity called Israel about 1200 before the Common Era. And it's located somewhere in Canaan. We don't know where in Canaan. We're not told. Some say, well, it's where later the nation of Israel grew up. But I don't see any evidence of that. We just know it was in Canaan. So, but it's an intriguing thing. And then we don't hear the name Israel again for another 400 years when we finally find it in an Assyrian inscription where Ahab is called the Israelite. And so that's the first reference to Israel after the one in Merneptah. So
just to be,
we know there was an sorry.
Oh no! Just to be clear, we're talking not using the biblical narrative, outside source that we can validate what's being said biblically. Is that Ahab is the first outside of the biblical text evidence that we have, and what would this be? The 8th century BC?
Yes, yeah, about 850, somewhere around there. Yeah.
So there's a big darkness there in terms of like history outside of the biblical narrative. And notice I said narrative. Like I want people to understand that the Bible's theology, and sometimes you do get this hint of history that finds its way there, especially as you get later into the biblical narrative. But one question I wanted to ask before we leave the Exodus in this area of discussion, since we kind of are clueless in a way of absoluteness of what happened and who and where and when and why, but it seems like the Exodus is also a foundation myth, and that Moses may be seemingly a foundation character like what we see with Abraham. If it walks like a duck and it talks like a duck and it seems like it's a duck, it doesn't mean that there isn't value. There aren't lessons, that he's not an amazing figure in their lore, but that's what it seems to be, especially when you take into account like this biblical Exodus does not even seem historically plausible, but it has a fantastic story about it, especially if you're living in an empire massive like Assyria or around conquering empires mighty, or the largeness of Egypt, looking at these pyramids. You want to reflect your story and compete, it seems, with the nations around. We see this in Genesis where they're competing with the Mesopotamian mythology. They demythologize the deities, of course, to make their Yahweh the one. And, there's competition in a way in terms of whose story is better. Am I on the right track, do you think, in my thinking of the Exodus being this kind of competitive narrative?
Yes, I think so. It certainly becomes an extremely used again, the term foundation, myth or story, and it becomes extremely important. And of course, the idea of liberation of slaves who are freed, and so on. And of course, it becomes commemorated in Judaism until the present day at Passover, Pesach, an extremely important symbolic celebration and a symbolic story. And of course, it gets picked up then in Christianity, and it's and through history, oppressed peoples have seen the Exodus as an inspiration. So it's an extremely important story, and we have to keep that in mind, because after all, Jesus spoke in parables. We shouldn't say, now wait, did this actually happen? No, we ask, what does it mean? What is the point being made?
Right.
And the point of the Exodus is extremely important. Whether there was a Moses, there was some figure. It's interesting. Some people have speculated. They've looked at Egyptian history and think maybe this Egyptian character or that one might have been the figure on which Moses was based. Possible, I don't know, but we don't have a figure that we can point to clearly in history that's Moses. So whether he existed or not, I don't know. But he's important in the story, and the story is an important story. There's no doubt about that.
Do you happen to know any anachronisms in the Exodus story which would tell us it was written a little later? I know this is on the cuff. Like, I want everybody to know. Like,
no. This is things that, but whether my aging brain will conjure this, I have written on this and so on. It's mainly a lot of it has to do with archaeology, and I'm not an archaeologist. I confess that, but I do draw on archaeology. I do read a lot of archaeology. And for instance, after the, well, first of all, the archaeology in Egypt doesn't show, as I say, some of the things that are supposed to have happened with the plagues. But when we look at where Israel went after they left Egypt in the story, for instance, it says if you follow the route that they took, and they spent a lot of time near a place called Kadesh in southern Palestine. And the archaeology hasn't found anything there that would relate to large numbers of people living in that area for 40 years. And then there are cities along the eastern side of the Dead Sea where the Israelites are said to have moved as they went up, and they came to the northern part of the Dead Sea, where then they crossed the Jordan. And again, the archaeology of those sites doesn't match what was in existence at that time. So the archaeology is a main figure against it. It's interesting that there are some places, there's a debate over cities like Ramses that are mentioned in Pithom, which are mentioned as storehouses that the Israelites built. Did they exist at that time? Well, I think with Pithom, I think it did exist in what is called the New Kingdom period. Depends on when some put the Exodus, 200 or 300 years apart from others. So exactly when you'd want to put it would be a question. But Pithom, I think, did exist. But Ramses is a name that it's found on several places and so on, as well as being the name of a king, of several kings. Actually, there's up to Ramses VI, I think. But the way it's written, at least it's been argued by Egyptologists, the way it's written is a later form of the writing of the name rather than is found in the biblical text compared with Egyptian. Now, when you're comparing Hebrew and Egyptian, of course, it gets technical. And of course, different scholars will debate this and so on. But from what I understand from Egyptologists, the name of the writing is somewhat different. Also, it wasn't called just Ramses, it was called Per Ramses, which means house of Ramses. And that doesn't occur there. And as one Egyptologist asked, what happened to the Per part of it? Why isn't that found in the biblical text? So there are things like that. Part of them relate to technical things, but it's mainly the archaeology, trying to find an archaeological confirmation, and the archaeology doesn't fit that period. And one Egyptologist, Donald Redford, wrote a book on the Joseph story and looked at various parts, various things in it, and argued eventually that it reflects an Egyptian background, but one of much later, the Saite period, which is about the 7th to the 5th centuries BCE. And again, he was a reviewer objected to that, who was also an Egyptologist, but is also wedded to a fundamentalist view of the Bible. So I don't know how far to take his, but I read the review and I wasn't convinced by it as far as my knowledge of Egyptology goes. And I think Redford generally, it's accepted that he's probably made a good point there, that the story of Joseph is a later version. Now, that is not the Exodus, but it's the same with
It's
some
related.
of the Exodus.
Yeah, I really love this. I have a scholarly friend named Dr. Robert Price who actually said, well, maybe God sent down vacuum cleaners with angels to clean up all the archaeological data. So, you guys can stop looking. He's so funny. But yeah, I love the stories. I want people to know that, because someone who may be watching is maybe already offended or whatever, because they're like, no, it is literally true. I used to think that. But no, I love these stories. I want to know the truth, though. And what is the truth? I think they're writing really interesting literature. And it seems, and maybe the motivation is, not only do we need to be like, compare ourselves in some way with the nations that are conquering us, or to be better than these nations, it seems competitive in nature. Everything seems to be kind of competitive, from demythologizing the Mesopotamian myths to Egypt, right? Our plagues are destroying their gods because our God is better than your gods. And it keeps going. This is what I see happening. So I just kind of wanted to know. And another question I have with the Mesopotamian background and the Egyptian story of the Exodus, which came first historically, the story wise, which came first? I've been told that the Genesis narrative of what we see with the Enuma Elish and stuff, we know this stuff's very old. People want to die on hills of, it's not plagiarism, it's plagiarism, it's this, it's that. And it's like, look, the heartbeat of the literature is there. I had a buddy recently do a video, and I'd love to get your thoughts on this, and I'll wrap it up to let you comment. I just want to give a little background for our audience who doesn't know this. A friend of mine just did a video on this where he showed that, there's a song that sounds very similar to this other song, and they got sued by Marvin Gaye. And the song plays, and you hear it, and then you hear the next one, and you're like, that's really close, but it's not the same song. And they got sued in court. It was legit. It was obvious that they definitely knew of that. Whether they changed a few things and they did this and that, and it's not identical, didn't matter. But there was some form of what we anachronistically today call plagiarism. And it made me think this Mesopotamian foundation myth we call Genesis, and there's different sources here. So I'm probably speaking in particular, I guess, Genesis 2 and on. I'm not sure where we would draw these lines at, because the documentary hypothesis, maybe you can explain that as well. But there's definitely that competition, and they are aware of their material. Can you take us into this region of literature?
Right. Yes, the first few chapters of Genesis do seem to have borrowed quite a bit from Mesopotamia. The idea of plagiarism wasn't one that was around at that time, and in fact is a fairly recent thing. People were still, I hear from musicologists that musicians would borrow from one another or steal from one another, and it wasn't against the law even up until recent centuries. But when we look at Genesis 1, you mentioned the Enuma Elish, which is the Babylonian creation myth. Now, we don't have anything quite like Genesis 1, which is the days of creation in Mesopotamia. But what we do have are a number of references that look very similar. And in the Babylonian creation myth, the gods are threatened by this monster of chaos called Tiamat. She's a woman, or a female figure, maybe I should put, but she's a monster. And the gods say, what shall we do? And finally one comes forward. His name is Marduk, who happens to be because the version we have is the Babylonian version, and Marduk was the chief Babylonian god. Though in Assyria, we have a version in which the figure is an Assyrian god, Ashur. And so they obviously tailored these things. But Marduk says, I'll fight her. And he goes and fights and defeats her. And then he creates the world by cutting her in two. And half of her goes above the earth and half goes below. And she's a sort of a watery figure. So there's water below and water above, which fits the image of the universe that we find in Genesis 1. That is, there's waters above and waters below, and the earth sort of floats on the waters below, and the waters above, some of it comes through as rain and all of this. But we have this universe that looks very similar to that we find in Babylonia. But we also have references to it. It says that the Spirit of God in Genesis 1:2, I think it is, moved on the face of the deep, which in Hebrew is Tehom. But Tehom is a cognate of Tiamat. Tiamat is the Assyrian word. Tiam, the middle of it is an aspirant, which Assyrians, at least in writing, had lost the H, but they had a glottal stop instead, Tiam. And the at is a feminine ending. So Tehom and Tiamat are cognate words. And later on, it talks about that God created the great, some versions put whales, some put sea monsters, but it's Tananim, which again is a word that is found in various myths as sort of figures of chaos. And so we do seem to have within the Genesis 1 some references to Mesopotamian creation myths and so on. But then if we move a little bit forward, and then Adam and Eve, again, we don't have quite the same story, but we do have stories of creation of humans, which have some, but again, these seem to be unique to the Hebrews, the creation version and the Adam and Eve. But then when we come to the flood, we suddenly have a story which is almost exactly, with very little difference between that and some flood stories found in Mesopotamia. And we have several of these over a long period of time. The Gilgamesh epic has a flood story in it, which is almost like the one in the biblical text. It even has the figure of, what is he called there? Utnapishtim, I think is his name in Mesopotamia, in that particular version. And he actually, when his ark stops, he sends out birds to ascertain what things are, just like in the creation myth of creation story in the biblical text. So it looks like there the Hebrew version is simply a borrowing from Mesopotamia, giving it, of course, the changing some of the details and so on, and so that it fits in, but it is probably an actual borrowing. but probably the creation story is not borrowed as such, but it influences.
Right.
I think influences the version found in Genesis.
One interesting point you bring up is this face upon the deep, which the Tahom is these waters, and of course
Right.
it's like once he faces the waters, kind of, it's like these, he's facing the waters, then there's this divide of above and below, and it does mimic by demythologizing Tiamat and giving waters its unique aspect. I wondered, and I'm just throwing this out there to get your thoughts, if Leviathan, which might be a version of Lotan or whatever, if Leviathan is this creature that is kind of reflected in Job of saying, I defeated Leviathan. Can you do this? Reflecting back to his creation, because when when God is like competing with Job, he brings up creation. I mean, he is over and over talking about what I made. Have you done this? Have you done that? I'm the one who did this. You see creation? I did it. And then he talks about, I think, the biggest of hurdles, which is this creature called Leviathan, this dragon that breathes fire. People try to demythologize it and make it sound like it's an alligator or some, come on.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
but it sounds like Leviathan would fit right in with that whole facing the waters and this creature. Now, maybe it's a different mythology about the origin of Israelite, the Israelite creation account. I don't know, but it sounds like you could almost lift Leviathan out of Job, slap him in Genesis 1-2 in a way, as another version of Tiamat. And I don't know, maybe I'm overthinking in parallels here, but I didn't know if there was something to that.
Yes, you're quite right. Leviathan doesn't appear in Genesis, but it does appear in other texts in the Bible. For instance, in the Psalm 27, you have God fighting Leviathan. And interesting there, the parallel is not in Mesopotamia so much as in Ugarit, the city which is much closer up on the coast of opposite Cyprus on the Mediterranean coast. And they spoke a language which it wasn't even known and discovered until the 1930s.
Wow.
Actually, the city was discovered in 1928, I think. But they found the language is very similar to Hebrew. And there were various myths that the Ugaritic people had. And one of their gods was Baal. And but he does a lot of things that remind you of what God does in the biblical text. But he at one point fights against a creature, an opponent, another god named Yam, which means sea. And he fights Yam and defeats him. But at one point he says, and he seems to be using different names for Yam, and one of them is Lotan. You mentioned Lotan. He said, didn't I defeat him? Didn't I do this and that? Didn't I defeat the twisting serpent and so on? And the language he uses there is very similar to that used of Leviathan in Psalm 27. The Leviathan, the twisting serpent, the fleeing serpent, or whatever. So it's very similar, and it looks like that is a common myth in that part of the world that the Israelites drew on, but also the people of Ugarit as well. So, but Leviathan is another monster of chaos, which was the creation consists in some of these myths of defeating these monsters of chaos, and you create the world by defeating the chaos.
And I don't want to get caught up, but I just want to reflect how interesting this worldview, this idea is, that even in Revelation, this chaos dragon shows its head, but they obviously now give it the place name of that old dragon, the serpent, the devil. So they're now equating Satan. It's kind of like they syncretize Satan into this creature that really wasn't originally designated for this creature.
That's right. They're drawing on this imagery, which has a long history to it, but would be familiar to people. to some extent, and they're drawing on it and making the equation, as you say. So it's a creative use of the tradition that was around.
Thank you for that. I really appreciate it. As far as the God of Israel that we would call Yahweh, or people call Jehovah, the origins of this God, Yahweh, was, it seemed, and I've heard this from like Francesca Stavrakopoulou or like other ancient, his Hebrew Bible scholars and stuff, that Yahweh was like a subordinate deity to El in a different pantheon. If I'm not mistaken, maybe it wasn't Yahweh. I'm not certain if the name Yahweh came up, but I definitely know El was in the Canaanite pantheon. And I was wondering, can you talk a little pre-Bible and maybe reflections that we find within our Bible that seem to indicate something of a development here?
Yes, the Canaanite pantheon, from what we can determine, and again, there's not one source we can go to and say this is the Canaanite pantheon. What we have are different versions of it. But for instance, in the Ugaritic text, the head of the pantheon was named El, or Ilu, which was the cognate of the Hebrew El, which is translated God in Bibles, but so you don't see it. Sometimes it's the plural Elohim, but the word El itself also occurs. And in Ugarit, he's sort of the head of that, but there is a younger, perhaps some say more dynamic, this is always a point of debate, dynamic god named Baal, and he's the one that also we find opposed to Yahweh, but he actually has many of the characteristics that we find in Yahweh, but Yahweh doesn't occur in the Ugaritic text. So we have El and Baal, but in the biblical text, when we start looking, we have a problem here because the later editors who put these traditions in the form that we have them, they were monotheists who regarded Yahweh as the chief, as the only God, and therefore they have edited the texts in such a way that some of the earlier versions seem to have been lost. But we do find still a number of names that are equated as being, well, these are the same as Yahweh, except probably they weren't the same as Yahweh originally. And one of them is El, another is Elah, and we have Elyon, and so we have different names that are in the present text are equated with, all said to be Yahweh, but weren't originally. But Yahweh first occurs, and it's thought that possibly Yahweh was borrowed from a group who lived in the area of southern Palestine, because we find in the Egyptian texts the name YH, and then a sort of a guttural sound that is written in Egyptian that may correspond, but it looks like it may be the name Yahweh, and it's
so this would have been an Egyptian god.
Well, it was a place name, I think, in the one Egyptian text where we have it. I think it's a place name, but some have said, well, it's clearly the same. And of course, places were often named after gods or had God's name in them, just as personal names did. Many of the biblical names have Yahweh in them. Jeremiah,
Elijah,
and so Elisha and Elijah, and all of these often have names. But El, for instance, Elijah, El, and has both El and Yahweh in it. So you get these names, but some think that maybe this indicates that the name Yahweh was borrowed, but it doesn't occur until the biblical text, and so we don't have any reference to I think the first use of Yahweh outside the Bible, I think, is the Misha Stela, which is about 800 of the Common Era, and it refers to their god Chemos conquered Yahweh, but Israel worships Yahweh. So it occurs outside the Bible about then, but it is found in the Bible and is of course, not just the chief deity, but the only deity according to the writers. But here and there you find indications that it wasn't like that, and that originally the Israelites worshipped more than one god. And this seems to be a consensus. And some of the inscriptions we have indicate that as well, that there's more than one god around.
Wow, this definitely goes deep into a lot of material. It's really interesting to hear where Yahweh kind of, like, where did this name for this deity come from? I did want to mention Deuteronomy 32, I think, for a second, just to kind of get your thoughts on this. That passage seems also to hint at this idea that Israel is Yahweh's inheritance. And this really raises my ears, if you will, to go, inheritance from whom? Isn't he the chief? Like, who would he inherit this from? But when you go far enough back, you realize God's inherited from their fathers. They had fathers, and their fathers had fathers. And there's this idea of Yahweh having a father, which would have been El. It seems to imply this, or the name changing with Moses. Your fathers knew me as El Shaddai, but I'm going to tell you my name is Yahweh. And it seems like maybe these are multiple traditions, like the documentary hypothesis discusses, and the redactor, this redaction criticism that people get into, this redactor is trying to unite multiple sources. I don't know. Just throwing the idea out there to get your thoughts.
Well, and Deuteronomy 32, verse 8 is a very important verse, because the way it stands now in the Hebrew Bible, the Masoretic text, it says that Yahweh's portion is Israel, but in the Septuagint, and now I'm without it in front of me, I'm not sure I can quote it correct, but in the Septuagint, it certainly is more directly indicating that is the Greek translation. But we also find the Hebrew version of that at one of the Qumran texts. So it existed in Hebrew, not just in Greek. And it does indicate, as you said, that it's Yahweh is El's portion. It looks like he is the heir to El. And we also have another, and again, I'm not sure I can give it word for word, but in Psalm, is it 82 or 89, it talks about Yahweh being, it talks about El. And again, this isn't always clear in the English translation, but it talks about El, and then it talks about Yahweh as being one of the sons of El. And so you do seem to have here and there an indication that Yahweh is part of a pantheon, but it's only here and there. They've done a pretty good job of editing it, but they didn't get quite everything, and it does seem to. And sometimes it's in a variant tradition that has come down, such as Deuteronomy 32:8, which was edited in Hebrew to be one thing, or at least in the Masoretic text to be one thing, but still survives in Hebrew and also in the Greek translation.
Just an interesting note, one of my buddies who really loves getting into this stuff showed me in Deuteronomy 32:43, I think it is. There's this passage that's clearly been redacted or corrected for the Masoretic, and we have in the Dead Sea Scrolls like what it actually would have said. Dr. Kip Davis, also, he's a Dead Sea Scroll scholar, was going on my show showing this, and there's this part like, all you gods give praise, and like the heavens, it's showing like a pantheon, and we have this fragment from the Dead Sea Scrolls. It's still showing us this. But the Masoretic, of course, by the time that's written, there's no way they're going to like reserve this information. So I just wanted to make an interesting plug on that. So we talked about the Philistine, or Philistine, however you want to pronounce it. I've had multiple pronunciations people have mentioned to me on how do you pronounce it. If you're from the South, just say Philistine. If you're from the North, it's Philistine. but I asked Aaron Mayer, and I said, I wondered if there's more truth to the Philistine having a real historical impact on the development of Israel than this Exodus narrative reflecting a cultural memory, let's say. Which one had more impact? And he said, well, I can't say it's either or, but both played a significant part in his view. And that over 300, 400, 500, 600 years, let's say, layer after layer of all of this cultural memory, they're pulling narratives, developments from these various regions and people they're clashing with, maybe people they're getting along with, maybe, in developing the story we call, the Israelite story of the development of Israel. Do you think that that's true in approaching this like that, or how do you approach it?
Yes, no, I would agree. The Philistines, they came in as they're one of the sea peoples that, and there's still quite a debate at the moment among specialists as to whether it was an invasion or perhaps it was more just settlers coming in, but probably a bit of both. But they settled in the southern part of Palestine, and they became, after a time, they became competitors with Israel. And of course, we have the story with Saul and the Philistines in Genesis. You already alluded to that. There weren't any Philistines around in the second millennium. They didn't come until about 1200, probably not as one big group, but probably more than one group over a period of time. But we know quite a bit about them because they left pottery. They had certain cities, and Aaron Mayer has been excavating one that was probably the ancient city of Gath and was quite an important city at one point. But anyway, Saul seems to have fought against the Philistines. It presents it as if they're trying to take over Israel. I think I've argued that it might have been the other way around. The Israelites lived in the hill country, and that wasn't as desirable an area as the area where the Philistines lived. So it was probably the Israelites raided the Philistines for a period of time and different times. And it may be that at some point the Philistines said, look, we got to stop these troublesome raiders, and perhaps went against them. But anyway, it's clear that the two were competitors. And eventually, of course, Israel won out. The Philistines eventually lost out, and their cities became, over several centuries, became possessed by the kingdom of Judah. And so some of their tradition may have got into the biblical text. We don't know how, but there were the Philistines at times, no doubt. This is always the case of people who live side by side. Even if they fight, they also share a lot, and they probably traded. There were times, and in fact, it indicates this. It said, well, the people would go down to Philistia to have their tools sharpened. Well, if you have a hoe, you don't go down, take a day trip to get it sharpened. But if you have a broken plowshare, you might go down, especially if you can't deal with the metal work, you might go somewhere and have it. And the Philistines, there is evidence that they were good at metalworking. Though again, that's another subject that archaeology has helped us on, but I don't know if we have everything we should know about it. But anyway, the Philistines certainly were good at metalworking. And so they probably shared a lot, and they may have shared traditions. Now, as they're presented in the biblical text, they're mainly enemies. They're mainly people at least not to be emulated. And we have Samson and fighting against the Philistines and then being betrayed and all of this. So most of the stories are anti-Philistines. And we have the story of the ark being Israel fighting against the Philistines, and the ark being taken and then getting various diseases and eventually returning it. And so it's always the Philistines are the ones who come out worse in the stories. but that doesn't mean that the lot wasn't picked up from them. But how much is difficult to say.
When did according to your knowledge, because I know you're not a specialist in Philistine, but when did the Philistine people cease to be, from what we can tell historically?
Well, they sort of the area is known as Philistia, the Philistine area, pretty much throughout Israel's history. But when they get taken over, some of the cities were destroyed by there was a Aramaic invader, Hasael, around 800, about 800, I think, who probably destroyed Gath, I think, and some of the other cities were Philistine probably for longer, but they get taken over, and there's not a time that I'm aware of when we can say, it's Philistine. The Philistines no longer exist. I think they eventually intermarry with the Judahites, and they become basically one people. I'm not aware of. They're not driven out, and they're not sort of slaughtered, so far as I know. So as they continued to live there, they would have eventually intermarried and so on.
This is kind of like reflected of the Canaanites when the laws are prohibiting Israelites from marrying them. You don't write prohibitions unless it's happening. So
unless it's happening, that's right. And of course, we have to keep in mind, as I point out, and others have pointed out as well, that Israel was Canaanite. They eventually had their identity and sort of made Canaanite a bugbear, but they were people who lived in Canaan, and Canaanite seems to have been a reference to people who lived in a particular area, not a particular ethnic group, but people who lived in an area, and the Israelites did. But then they developed this tradition that, if you're not Israelite, you're Canaanite, and that's bad.
Wow. I really, really appreciate you. We're coming up on our hour, and I want everyone to please take the time, go get some of Dr. Lester L. Grabbe's work. And I'm telling you, you could tell already just from this 1 hour that there is so much more to discuss. I love this. I really do. And I hope that you'll go support his work by get you a couple copies. Go find some of his actual books. Which ones did you actually publish yourself and not just co-edit or edit?
Well, most of mine are not aimed at a broader audience, but the one on Second Temple Judaism is aimed at a broader audience, and we didn't even talk about Second Temple Judaism.
Oh, we haven't even opened up that can of worms.
But that one I would recommend to people as being aimed at a broader audience. Many of the others are aimed really at specialists. My Ancient Israel. It talks about the history of Israel starting, it really starts with where we started today. Where did Israel originate, and goes until the fall of Jerusalem to the Babylonians. And that one is not aimed at a broader audience, so it necessarily, but I hope that at least educated people, which many of your people will, people who observe this will be have knowledge of the Bible and have knowledge of some of the things, and so would find it profitable, I think, to read it. And I do give sources, but one of the things I was trying to show there is, what do we know? That is, what are our sources? Where do we get our information? And what are the means by which we know this? And so I was trying to address that question. So those two books I would recommend, especially for probably your audience. The others tend to be more specialized. The Judaism from Cyrus to Hadrian is Second Temple, also covers the Second Temple period, but is the other one that the single volume on Second Temple Judaism is probably a better place to start.
Wow. And the book that you're currently wrapping up as we speak, that book, do you have any idea when that will be out? This is on the origins of Israel?
Well, it's in the press, and I haven't received page proofs and so on, and that stage takes some time. But I would think it'd be out by the autumn, probably. Yeah.
Well, let's do an episode on this once you have it out, and let everybody know to go get a copy. You are a treasure. I really enjoy this. Once again, just so everybody knows, Dr. Lester L. Grabbe is a retired American scholar and emeritus professor of Hebrew Bible and early Judaism at the University of Hull, England. We hope to have you back here on MythVision. You are a breath of fresh air, just enlightening everybody. So let us know in the comment section down below what you thought of the episode. How did you take it? You know, I really enjoyed this. I learned a lot, and there's a lot of this stuff I'd heard, but he just went a little deeper in different areas. So please like the video, go get a copy of his work, and never forget, ladies and gentlemen, we are MythVision. Ladies and gentlemen, join MythVision's Patreon, not only to support us, but there are 72 videos that I did with Dr. Dennis R. McDonald and Richard Carrier, all on the Patreon, early access. You guys can ask personal questions when I go to interview these scholars, and you're helping MythVision grow.